All right, looks like we have a lot of people on the line. There's about 300 of you, if you're wondering, so super exciting. Without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our panelists today. We will start with Myrna Castrejón. She is CEO of the California Charter Schools Association. And then we also have Ron Rice. He's Senior Director of Government Affairs at the National Alliance. Next, we have Debbie Veney, Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the National Alliance. And finally, Todd Ziebarth, who is Senior Vice President of State Advocacy and Support. Today, we'll walk through kind of the federal level, an overview of how outcomes have shaped things there. We'll dive into the state level, and then we'll even potentially zero in on districts. So we're so thankful you're here. Happy Thanksgiving week, everyone. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Debbie Veney for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Shaelyn. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We thought it was important to be able to pull everyone together because like all of you, we too were saying, whoa, what does all this mean after we came through the 2020 election cycle? And as you know, education is rarely a single voter issue. So it was interesting this year because it actually was more highly ranked than usual. So we saw a lot of polling, a number of polling data coming into the 2020 election that showed us that it actually was a pretty significant factor in a lot of voters' decisions. So it was like a kind of a number 4, right behind the economy, jobs, healthcare, and safety. And we also know that the pandemic created this special set of circumstances coming into this year's election, so that we really saw parents becoming much more engaged by force into their children's education, because immediately many children had to be homeschooled, and this digital learning thing was a big surprise for a lot of parents. And what we saw is that they reacted to that by really voting with their feet. And we saw a significant spike in charter school enrollment across the country. And that was a really lovely setup to what we saw happening at ballot boxes across the country. So in short, charter school supporters fared pretty well in a number of elections. And we're going to dig into what that looks like at both the federal and the state level, and kind of unpack some of the things that were big wins, some of the things that were surprises, and some of the things that we need to do to get our ground game ready for the next one, because midterms are just 2 years away and never can start too early. So Ron, my friend, why don't we start with you? Let's take a look at the federal landscape coming out of the elections earlier this month. So how should we feel? How should the charter school sector feel about the outcome of those elections?
So first, thanks for having this webinar. I think it's important to really start to unpack some of the results while they're still sort of fresh in everybody's minds. And so I think certain narratives would have us believe that it's not a great landscape for us, but I would disagree. But I put a bit of caution with that I think the results were actually very good for us, but that should actually make us want to fight a lot harder to make sure that what appears to be good actually will be good in terms of practice. I think when you look at the presidential piece, for example, voters in 2020, I think, voted for action and getting things done. I think that's true for fighting because of the COVID-19 pandemic. They voted for getting the economy back on track. I think it's true for dealing with existential environmental issues, and definitely social justice issues for African Americans. And while K-12 education, as you mentioned, was scantily discussed or even debated with any real seriousness during the presidential cycle, primaries in general, I'm sure it's going to be the same with education. I think it's mainly due because of the pandemic, and academically 2020 may be seen as the lost year for American students. But to me, that also means that the electorate was looking for a new president to embrace policies that work and support things that actually do work right now, and not to throw away anything that is shown to be providing solutions to really intractable problems right now. Essentially, America does not have the luxury to rely on calls to rhetoric when evidence and data and research show something completely different. I think that was the appeal of the Biden campaign, and I think it's what Americans voted for. So when you put that with the fact that nonpartisan study after study in the last 8 years have clearly shown the value and results of high quality charter schools and public education, especially in urban communities and for Black and Brown children. And even during the COVID-19, charter schools have thought and acted outside of the box in providing hybrid learning models and acting as centers for food distribution and COVID testing and community information and such. I think actually when the Biden administration and the president-elect actually look at charter schools, he's going to see an ally in terms of getting things done. And I'll just add that despite the rhetoric, when we talk about the presidential election, as a U.S. Senator, President-elect Biden, as was reported by the Wall Street Journal, was always a supporter of what works in public education, period. As a senator, he supported and holding states and schools accountable for their students' performances, expanding public school choice, and increasing federal funding for charter schools and their facilities. And he served as a moderate, he's governed as such, and has been responsive to parents. And if he continues to listen to all public school parents, especially the real life experiences of Black and Brown people in urban areas, I think he's going to continue to be who he always has been.
Okay. So let me ask you this. The Biden election is changing the landscape in some other kinds of ways. So we've got a couple of Senate seats that are going to come open due to, having a new vice president, and also Cedric Richmond, who's not in the Senate, but in the House. Cedric Richmond is going to be joining the president's cabinet. So here's my question. How do you think those shifts are going to impact our support at the federal level?
Well, it's always good to have members of Congress who've been somewhat supportive of our priorities to join the administration. It's just more voices in the ears of those decision makers and the president-elect about the importance of our schools. And that's something that Cedric Richmond has been in terms of Congress and other voices that I think will potentially join the administration. But the 117th Congress is actually going to have more Republicans and, yes, even more Democratic members that support quality public schools in general, and specifically and including charter schools, despite, again, the narrative that's put forth by some. We had a lot of Republican charter supporters who were returned to office, such as Senator Thom Tillis from North Carolina, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, John Cornyn from Texas, Bill Lindsay from Wyoming, among others. And in the GOP House, we have new members, including Byron Donalds from Florida, an African-American Republican member who sends his kids to charter schools, Pat Fallon from Texas, and Madison Cawthorn from North Carolina. But even among the Democrats, we're glad that supporting and returning senators, including Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, Chris Coons from Delaware, Dick Durbin from Illinois, and newcomer former Governor John Hickenlooper from Colorado, which makes that state the third state with an all-Democratic Senate lineup that supports charter schools and their families that send their kids there. And in the Democratic House, we have new supportive members that include Richie Torres from New York, Marilyn Strickland from Washington, Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts, among others. So it should be noted that also that a lot of the candidates that were specifically endorsed and supported by some well-known status quo education establishment protectors, for lack of a better term, lost in the House and in their Senate bids, some pretty spectacularly. So I think when people are voting, and they did vote in this election, despite the constant battering and anti-charter rhetoric over the last 2 years, I think polls still show strong support among charter schools, particularly among Black and Brown voters in urban areas. And as you know, those were the vote makers and the vote changers that drove the election for Biden and a number of Democrats in the House and the Senate. Those folks were not fooled, and they continue to support charter schools throughout this entire 2020 session.
So when you look at what happened this year, let's do a look back at 2018 midterm elections. It sounds to me like I hear you saying we should be cautiously optimistic in the sector about the outcome of this election, but
emphasis on cautiously optimistic is the correct term.
So you feel that we fared better in 2020 than we did in 2018?
I think the landscape is a little bit better. I think mainly because of the change in the White House. I do think that, as I mentioned, that I think that the president-elect has always governed as a moderate. I think if we're going to get anything done in the 117th Congress, he has to extend his hand to create a big tent. And that does not just include progressives and moderates within the Democratic Party. He's going to have to reach across the aisle for Republicans. And even if the Republicans, and that's very true, the Republicans maintain control of the U.S. Senate, but it's even true if they lose it slightly, because the numbers are going to be so close. It'll be 51-49 or 50-50 even in terms of the breakdown. In order to get anything passed, they're going to have to be voices of moderation that actually are over the far left and far right voices that are trying to pull at the administration. And again, I think this is the perfect governing model. It's not really triangulation, but it's the perfect governing model for a Biden administration to work to try and get things done in a pragmatic way. Everybody's going to have to be pragmatic. And in that sense, it does benefit the charter sector that the more moderate voices of both parties in our big tent, I think will have more sway. And again, in investing in pragmatic solutions when it comes to education, things that actually work. And our schools work by and large across this nation. And so I think it bodes well for our future as a result of that. But I also think 2020, as I mentioned before, with some of those specific names, we have some new voices coming to Congress that are going to be reflective of where I think Americans are when it comes to public school choice. And that is they would support what works and are not really driven or pushed by the rhetoric that some would have on either side of the aisle.
So would you feel comfortable giving us a little bit of a peek into who you think some of these new voices are that are going to show up as champions?
Sure. So I mentioned a few when I first started. I think on the Republican side, I think of Byron Donalds from Florida, new congressman who's African American, who's a conservative, who's replacing Francis Rooney in the House, who has a history of supporting charter schools, sends his own children to charter schools. I think on the left, if you will, on the Democratic side, you have Marilyn Strickland from Washington State, who has done when the referendum in Washington was being debated. She filmed a support video as a former mayor in Washington State. I think Richie Torres from New York is another one. I think Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts is another Democrat going forward. And I think you're going to find even Governor John Hickenlooper, who's from Colorado, who's former governor of that state, Colorado is a very strong state that has bipartisan support for charter schools, coming to Washington too. You know, my hope is that those voices will find themselves in the middle, working with current Democrats, for instance, like Cory Booker and Chris Coons and Dick Durbin and Michael Bennet, who have already been champions for us in the Senate. They'll join them and they'll reach across the aisle to a Bill Cassidy or a Tom Tillis from the Republican side and John Cornyn to really talk about what works and support those kind of educational policies going forward. And again, I think what balances all that out is that we have a president whose very history of being involved in government has been about bringing people together, having a moderate sort of viewpoint, a way forward on what's pragmatic and what actually works. And I'm confident that that's going to be the way that Joe Biden is going to have to govern, whether he wants to or not, because that's the way things actually get done in this town. The last thing I'll say is that I think, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later down the line, is that Black and Latino voters, I think, not only put their stamp on this election, but if you look at them, how after George Floyd, they're talking about, those communities are talking about not just pragmatically trying to change things around the edges, they're talking about systematic changes to end systematic white supremacy. And that applies to everything, and I think it includes education. So I think the voices of Black and brown voters that you saw at the polls in 2020 are going to start pushing policy more and more. And those folks are not happy with the status quo of traditional district schools that currently exist in our communities. And they want change, and they want radical change. And so charter schools provides, I think, for a lot of these folks, the only hope in many communities to get a quality education. And I think those voices you saw quite clearly through the Freedom Coalition showing up at Democratic presidential primaries throughout this whole dominating process, that you see other groups stepping up.
Mhm.
Very, very true. Very true. Standing up and saying, we want these charter schools. We support these schools. And I think as you see more and more parents, more and more graduates, students who have attended these schools, and more other mainstream organizations like the 100 Black Men of America, Unidos US, even Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, organizations that are starting charter schools and advocating for them, stepping up and having those voices come to the fore, you're going to recognize, I think, a giant that has been sleeping, but it's going to start advocating and being a lot more forthright with their support for charter schools. Indeed, joining people like Russell Wilson and Sierra and starting charter schools, Common and Pitbull and P. Diddy. Black folks are starting to say, we want charter schools, not just reflected in polling, but in reflecting and actually demanding it and actually confronting traditional folks who may have been against charter schools to talk about what they mean in their communities and what they mean to the students and their children that they have to send to school every single day.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Ron. I'm going to pivot over to our friends Myrna and Todd to talk a little bit about state. There's some great questions. I want you guys to know that I see your questions, and I'm going to get our state perspective into play, and then we are going to be able to address some of the really great questions that will come up in the chat. Okay, so Todd, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you a similar question to what I started out with asking Ron. How should we feel as a charter sector about the outcome of these elections at the state level?
I think we should feel, well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's afternoon where everybody's at. Thank you for jumping on the phone today for this important conversation. So I think initially we should feel relieved about the results. We were fearing a repeat of 2018 at the state level, where we saw a lot of new Democratic governors and a lot of new Democratic state legislators who kind of came in reflecting the more liberal tilt of the party, and neutral at best on charter schools, if not outright hostile. So we were very concerned that we might see a repeat of that in the 2020 election. And the good news is we didn't. So initially relieved. And I think if you look across the country, and I'll go through this here briefly, that the political environment for charter schools is slightly better than it was before the election. And I think it gives us a real opportunity to begin to rebuild our support in the Democratic Party without President Trump and Secretary DeVos in office, which the unions have used very effectively to drive a wedge in the Democratic Party between charter school supporters and charter school opponents. So real quickly, I just want to go through the governor's races, the state superintendent races, and the legislative races to give folks a sense of why things are a little bit better than they were before. First off, in the governor's races, there were 11 this year. And as a result of the elections, we have 6 supporters in those offices, 4 folks who are neutral, and only 1 who's an outright opponent. The 2 races we were watching the closest were first in Montana, where the incumbent governor, who's an opponent, was running for the US Senate and lost. And he was actually replaced by a person who's a charter school supporter. So Montana is one of the 5 states without a charter school law. We think the election of Greg Gianforte will provide an opportunity there to get a charter school law on the books over the next 4 years. The other state we were watching closely was New Hampshire, where the incumbent governor, Chris Sununu, won re-election, and he's been a pretty strong supporter for us there. And why that's significant is they actually have a federal charter school program grant that's been held up, and the combination of him winning, along with some changes in the legislature, is going to allow charter schools in that state to access those critical funds. So those are the governor's races. On the state superintendent side, there were only 4 races. And in those, we saw 2 folks win who were supporters. We saw 1 opponent win, and then we saw a person win where she has not stated a position on charter schools. So the 2 states where we saw folks win who are supporters were Montana and North Carolina. In Washington State, the incumbent won re-election. He's not been a supporter. So both in the governor's races and the state superintendent races, the only opponents were both from Washington State, Governor Inslee and Chris Reichdahl, the state superintendent. The race we were watching the closest was North Carolina. That was in a state sort of important in the presidential race, in the U.S. Senate race there, in the control of the legislature, and in this state superintendent race. And the person who won is a supporter, so we were happy about that. And then the last thing I'll say for the moment is,
were you surprised? I was shocked about the North Carolina state superintendent outcome. Were you surprised too?
Yeah, I was surprised in the sense that, you had a Democratic governor running for re-election who's sort of neutral on charter schools. You had an open seat there for the state superintendent race. And, there was real concern that the Democrat had the momentum and was going to win. And she was been pretty hostile about charter schools. And so we were, pleasantly surprised to see the result there. So the last thing I want to say for the moment is on the state legislative chamber side, according to the National Conference for State Legislatures, this was one of the most status quo elections in recent history, meaning there were only 2 chambers that actually flipped party control, and they were both in New Hampshire. The House and Senate flipped from Democrat to Republican. And again, that's important for the CSP there. But all of the other chambers, like in Arizona, in Michigan, in North Carolina, where we thought there might be a changeover in party control, it stayed status quo.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, Todd. Myrna, I want to double down and talk a little bit about what happened in our great state of California. So first of all, there was a ton of money and effort spent in down ballot elections in the state of California to try and basically suppress charter schools. And can we talk a little bit, let me get your take on what happened with the LAUSD school board election in particular.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, as you'll recall, just to add some framing context here, 2018, just like we did nationally, but certainly in California, we had the most Democratic state in the union go from blue to midnight blue. The Democrats secured a giga majority in both houses, and we ended up on the wrong side of the election in the state superintendent race and the governor's race. And literally when the 2019 legislative session began, there were open whispers in the corridors of the Capitol that we were dead, DEAD dead. And we really faced the biggest existential legislative crisis that we ever had encountered. But nonetheless, even in that moment where we were forced to negotiate literally with a gun to our heads, we managed to stop a full moratorium, stop a permanent cap, stop summary closures, and we played a key role in stopping the summary end of Teach for America in California. I remember early in 2019, the strikes really, took center stage in California. In Los Angeles and then in Oakland. And what ended up happening with the compromise legislation was that very clearly ensuring the chain of appeals. And once having settled the state legislative framework or policy framework, that the real fight was going to be in county boards for appeals and in local districts, not the least of which was LAUSD, which is the largest single authorizing jurisdiction in the US and houses more than a full third of California's charter movement. So recapturing a board majority was absolutely critical there. And it really was our primary focus, especially since in the last few months, they passed implementing policy at LAUSD on 1505, which was the compromise legislation that really went far beyond the original construct of the legislation, far beyond what the governor's intent envisioned. And it really made it very clear to us that that was truly existential. So needless to say, while we played and were active in legislative races across the state, our first priority were LAUSD and the key counties where it was really important to protect, because we see it this way. 2019 was all about setting a new policy framework and trying to stay as focused and viable in a policy framework that was adapted to the times. But this is the year where the implementing regulation, both at the state board and in the key districts, is really going to make that either do or die for us. So it's either going to overreach or be protective of our schools in this incredible moment. And that was our key target. Nonetheless, there's no question, Debbie, that I see a tremendous amount of opportunity. Just as Ron was talking about the congressional delegation, and by the way, Republicans are sending 4 new Congress people out of the California delegation, which for us, it's a good and healthy moderating effect on California. What we found out in this election was that California's electorate is actually much more moderate than the activists on both extremes. And that is good for us. That is very good for us. We managed to succeed at our legislative targets. Not our electoral targets. We flipped the LAUSD board majority in what has yet again become the most expensive school district race. But we did it. We won one, we lost one. But we have a 4-3 majority, one that we believe will yield the opportunity for more robust dialogue about how can we continue to strengthen our schools and set policies for the long run that will help us finish the job of 2019 in setting a new and good framework.
That is fantastic. This is the last planned question, and then I'm going to go to the fantastic group of questions that I see coming up in the chat. But let me ask you this. So we've often heard that, you look at California and you see what's happening for the rest of us, particularly within the charter space. What do you think that our colleagues on this line can learn from you in terms of what they need to do to get themselves ready for midterm elections next time around?
Well, midterm elections really started yesterday, or on November 4, I should say. And I think it's much more important for all of us to really build the infrastructure for the grassroots and to really be able to turn on those the activist spigot within our charter movement. We've been Ron and Todd and you are raising the really core issues of what constituency building really can do in this moment. In LAUSD and in key districts, counties, I should say, like Santa Clara, we saw an unprecedented level of engagement for our charter leaders themselves to raise money, focus on PACs, do a lot of direct giving, and get very engaged in this election. I think more and more the pressure will be on us to be the change, to be the engine. There's no question that there's, especially given the pandemic, there is a long overdue true focus on equity. And we see the polls.
Do you think the pandemic helped you coming into the 2020 election?
Absolutely, I believe so. For the same reasons that Ron was raising at the top of the hour. Here in California, most school districts really didn't get their act together for a good 8 to 12 weeks after the order to shut down came through. California's charter schools within 72 hours had deployed full distance learning, and a good chunk of them had 100% delivery of devices, whether it be hotspots or computers. But the real story is what we've always known to be true. Charter schools are better at building community. Charter schools are better at building a sense of belonging. And every time I talk to our members, that is the value add. From parents reaching out to parents to help each other out with platforms, technology platforms, to kids reaching out to other children, the sense of we're all in this together, as opposed to what districts have struggled to do, is absolutely remarkable. And I know it's something that is being looked at very, very carefully. We've got a long way to go before we're out of this pandemic. I think families are seeing very clearly what their kids do or do not have access to. Our polling numbers continue to be overwhelmingly favorable, especially among vulnerable communities. Black and brown students and families want and appreciate charter schools. And in a moment where the political pendulum is swinging a little bit away from the extreme rhetoric of the past 2 years, and we can see the evidence of that, not just in education, but also with other sectors, with tech, with healthcare. I think it's fair to say that the electoral results were a good corrective toward the center to some of labor's priorities. And frankly, it gives us an opportunity to have a more robust dialogue where we're not, like on our backs playing defense only.
Thank you for that. Guys, I've got a really great group of questions, so I want to get as many of these in as I possibly can. So I'm going to ask if we can try to do these as rapid fire as possible. All right, Ron Rice, you're up first. So I've got a question from Ramona Edelin, and she's asking, is there still a charter school caucus in the Senate? So she's thinking specifically about Lamar Alexander retiring and Mary Landrieu, who is no longer in the Senate, but used to lead such a caucus. Is that a thing anymore?
It is not a thing. It is something we probably need to bring back, considering that we do still have some really strong supporters there. But it does not exist. There is a House version of it that has changed names, but it is mostly Republicans. Unfortunately, a lot of our Democratic friends are supportive, but not as front as we need them to be. So it is something that I think we should look at. I think something that we should investigate, and I think something we maybe need to pursue in the 117th.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question we've got coming in from William Mall, and I think everybody here, Myrna, Todd, Ron, and probably even I could offer a little bit of thoughts on this one. And the question here is, do we, as the public charter school sector, have a voice in recommending to the President-elect Biden candidates for Secretary of Education? Anybody is welcome to jump in, or I can call on you. Okay, there you go.
I'm going to call on you, Debbie.
You're going to call on me? Okay, great. Yes, we do have a voice in that. And we are using both formal and informal channels to make sure that our intent is well known. I'll also tell you guys that we're working with a coalition of other organizations, and they're not all charter organizations, although some are. And we have put together a list of what we would consider to be the primary qualifications for any good Secretary of Education. So for our journalist friends that are on the line, keep your eye out for that. We'll be releasing it soon. But we found it most productive to talk about what a good secretary should look like, rather than casting a vote, so to speak, on behalf of one particular person or another. This horse trading thing is often just a ruse, and it gets people distracted from what the real issues are. So we are in conversations with many who are close to the President-elect and to the transition team, and certainly through those formal channels have done so. And a number of our partners, some on this very call, have also been really, really vocal and letting the President-elect and his cabinet his transition team, know what it is that we're looking for from a Secretary of Education.
Debbie, can I just add a quick word there? I think there's rightful concern among charter school folks about a Secretary Weingarten or a Secretary Escalin Garcia, which would be probably the worst case scenarios for us. And that's why I think the Senate races in Georgia are particularly important. I'm a registered independent, so I really don't care about Democrats from Republicans. I'll just say for this particular issue, if the Republicans do hold the Senate, that's going to moderate who Joe Biden can nominate for Secretary of Education as well for any of his other appointments. So the probability we'd see a Secretary Weingarten or Escalin Garcia or anybody who is so fiercely anti-charter school as those two would be reduced. The likelihood that they'd be nominated would be reduced. So I think that's something to watch, and that's going to directly impact who ends up in that seat.
And to jump on even what Todd said even further, even if the Dems get a majority in the Senate, you need all of those votes in order to get somebody across the line. I am not certain that there are certain Democrats who would not support the names that Todd put forward as being too extreme for where they represent. A Manchin, for instance, in West Virginia, some of the other ones who may be coming up in midterms in 2022 to stand election. And so it's not a home run guaranteed hit that if someone puts up these sort of, let's be honest, that would be a major detriment to charter schools. They'd have to think twice about whether they could get 50 votes out of the current Democrats if they were to take that many seats in the Senate. So I think either way, whether the election in Georgia goes and confirms a Republican majority, or if it's a small Democrat minority, those are going to be real things that the Biden administration will have to look at in terms of who they present and put forward as a nominee for education secretary.
And can I also just add one last, this is, I want to make clear, this has nothing to do with odds making one way or the other. But I have to say that Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond was the head of the transition team for President Obama. And she is also the head of the transition team for education for President-elect Biden. She is the current chair of the State Board of Education, an academician at Stanford, with whom we've had a long relationship with. And we've had a very productive relationship with her since Governor Newsom named her to the presidency of the State Board. And I can tell you that she is fair and thoughtful and truly committed to issues of equity and what is working well. So I take great comfort in knowing that there is such a professional at the helm of the search process.
Awesome. Thank you all for that. I've got another question coming in from Michael Nitsky. And this one is whether we should expect a Biden Department of Education to approve state testing waivers, and when would that happen? Ron, I'm going to throw that at you.
Yeah, I suspect it would be soon. I suspect it would be part of any kind of major COVID package in terms of direction for districts and the like fairly soon. So I don't want to say in the first 100 days, but it makes sense that it would probably be somewhere in the first 100 days as part of a comprehensive strategy to deal with COVID. And that would actually entail how to deal with schools, not just dispensing dollars and PPE and the like, but also how we were going to deal with testing and assessment. And let me just say that in terms of our movement, the civil rights organizations are more aligned with us when it comes to about assessment and accountability issues going forward. So that's another place for us to stand lockstep with other organizations as we go forward dealing with COVID and how our schools and our students are going to be treated in the new year.
Well, that's a beautiful transition into the thing I wanted to ask you next. We've got a question that came up in here about our good friends at the NAACP and how we feel about, we could offer any comment on the position that the NAACP has historically taken on charter schools.
Well, I always think it's interesting. Yeah, I always think it's interesting that sort of the fallback is NAACP's position as sort of representing, I don't know, sort of the Black consensus on charter schools. What I think is most interesting is the amount of the plethora of Black organizations that have not joined in the calling for moratoriums. And indeed, those organizations that are actually working alongside folks. I mentioned 100 Black Men of America. I mentioned Unidos US. I mentioned fraternities and sororities who are starting charter schools. I mentioned even chapters of the Urban League who have had charter schools, of National Action Network who are actually standing with the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools. And so I think it's wrong to frame it as like they're NAACP chapters who don't support the moratorium that we work with. And so I think the question should be asked, why are there not more Black organizations, supposedly Black organizations, that actually have joined that moratorium call? And so they are actually not in the mainstream, if you will, of organizations like that. We work every day, and again, I fashion back to the Freedom Coalition of Charter Schools. That is an impressive array of Black organizations, of people of color-led charter schools who have broken the mold that are going out. That's the care and feeding that needs to happen, and that needs to be strengthened going forward in terms of the face of the movement, in terms of the voice of the movement, and in terms of prioritizing what our priorities are for the next Congress.
Ron, I think you raise a really important point about people claiming their own voices and speaking for themselves and not necessarily allowing other entities to speak for them. And we've got a great question from Matt Barnum from Chalkbeat. And Todd, I'm going to throw this one at you because I know you're going to like it. So the question here is, what do we think about the proposed regulations or changes for charter schools that were proposed by they were proposed in the platform language for President-elect Biden. And specifically, this was about banning for-profit charter operators and giving local school boards a way to determine whether or not a potential grantee for CSP should be funded. And Myrna, I'm happy for you to jump in on that one too, as you would represent the state level response there.
Sure. So we don't like those proposals at all. They're terrible for charter schools and their students. They're reflective of the NEA and the AFT's playbook for several years. They're ideas they've been pushing all across the country to try to shut down charter schools. And so I think this is important as we think about the threats, right? I agree with Ron in terms of being cautiously optimistic, and agree with emphasizing cautious, because if, for example, the Republicans take this or hold the Senate, or the Democrats take it by a slight margin and have the challenge to get 50 votes that Ron mentioned, I think we will be protected in terms of the budget process, right? In terms of the federal charter schools program and the union's desire to cut, if not eliminate, that program. We'll have to work hard, but I think we'll have success in protecting that program. The threat then comes more on the Department of Education in the whole death by 1,000 cut strategy, in the administration of the CSP, perhaps in the administration of other federal programs like Title I, where the department might attach requirements to those programs to try to get states to change what their charter school laws look like. And the biggest threat here, in my opinion, is something that came out a week or two ago in an article by the Education Writers Association, where they were quoting Biden's national campaign policy director, who basically said, we only want to give federal money to charter schools authorized by local school districts, which would mean half of the charter schools in the country would be closed, which is about 3,500 to 4,000 charter schools, if you play that out in worst case scenario. And so we are deeply concerned by those kinds of boneheaded ideas, and we're hopeful that that's more reflective of this person's inexperience on the issue than it is a real desire by the Biden administration to do it. To Ron's point earlier about, Biden governing as a moderate, if he governs as a moderate, he will throw those kinds of ideas out the window, because they would be extremely harmful to students in 3,500 to 4,000 charter schools across the country.
Absolutely.
So.
And there's also that inconvenient truth about democratically elected school boards, which is not all district school boards are democratically elected. And so
Right.
It creates a particular set of crazy hurdles that would potentially exist for a charter school that don't even exist at a district school level, or you might not even have a governing body that can even carry out this sort of a thing because it just doesn't even exist. Guys, we are at 2 minutes, but Myrna, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on this as well.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the reality of it is like these things happen because some ideas are tested and tried, and Todd is absolutely right. These are not new. There's a national playbook that has been playing out for several years and a couple of legislative cycles. Those were the issues around which they came, to the table in 2019 in California, and we certainly have a lot of experience in working through debunking some of those issues or seeing the flaws in that method. The reality of it is that there's a very varied did I say that right? Network and patchwork of different policy constructs. There is no one size fits all, just like we know with charter schools. California does not have alternative authorizers, but so many of our schools do, and it's working incredibly well. And we wish we had more alternatives. There is absolutely no reason to take away things that are working. And I do believe that if we make the right case about what is working, our schools will absolutely continue to rise to the challenge and the evidence, because we are doing amazing work nationally.
Guys, we are 1 minute over, so we are at time. I'm sorry I can't take any more questions from the team who've called in to join us today, but thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you to the fantastic panel that we've got assembled here today. You guys were awesome. And thank you, Shaelyn, for being our mistress of ceremonies.
Thank you. And if you guys have further questions, all of the emails of the panelists are at the top of the chat. My email in particular, I'm happy to help kind of make sure those questions find their proper answers. And that's my first name, Shaelyn @publiccharters.org. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have further questions. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Take care.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone. Take care.